Welcome. We are in Junior English. And our discussion now turns to one of America's greatest, let's put it in our notes right away, novelists. I'm with you in your textbook on 270, 271. Nathaniel Hawthorne. Hawthorne. Wow. We have now met and are about to meet a major gun in American fiction. Short story and novel writing. Hawthorne writes maybe the most significant novel of the American literary tradition in the early years. The name of that novel, you probably know it already. You see the title mentioned on 271, Scarlet Letter. The story that opens with a woman standing on scaffolding holding an infant in a town where all of the people from the town are standing in the city center. She's holding a child. On her dress, a large letter A has been sewn onto her dress. The A stands for the word adultery, to sleep with someone who is not your husband. She's holding a child. The child is a product of a relationship she had with a man she will not name. The preacher of the town is standing in front of her on the scaffolding, and he says, "You will name the name of the father who gave you that child, because he's not your husband. And you will be punished, and he will be punished, and the child will be punished." And she says, "No." And the preacher says, "Excuse me?" His name is Dimsdale. "Excuse me? But I am the preacher and the most important man in this town. You will tell us the name of the man." And she says, "No." And he says, "I don't think you understand what you are not being asked to do. You are being told to do this. You will become a complete outcast of our town. You will not live in our town. You and that child of yours, that daughter of yours, will not live in our town if you don't tell us the name of the man who gave you that child, because he's not your husband." And she says one more time, "No." She loves her man so much, she won't give him up. Sure enough, they throw her out of the town. The child grows up. The reader comes to realize, halfway through the novel, the father, are you ready for this? The father of the child is Dimsdale, the preacher. The preacher who was standing there at the beginning of the novel saying, "Name the name of your lover who gave you that child." The father is the preacher who is telling her, "Name him." And she goes, "No. I love him too much to ruin his reputation." Whew. Pretty interesting novel. How does the novel end? I'm not going to ruin it for you. I'll let you read it on your own, but I'll give you a hint. Hawthorne is brilliant about finishing what he starts. The novel ends on the scaffolding with all three parties there. Woo! On the scaffolding with all three parties there. Very interesting. Very interesting. Welcome to Hawthorne. Now we're going to turn to a story called The Minister's Black Veil. Now before we turn to this on 270, I want to be sure that you're paying attention to the literary analysis information. Do you see it in bold on 270? I hope you've written it down at the 2A section of your annotations. A parable, are you ready for this, is a story with some kind of implied meaning. So you want to write down the word parable. The word ambiguity, one that you've written down, means that things aren't always very clear. Can I say this in advance? When you finish this story, you're not going to be totally sure what happened. Can I say that again? You may want to write it down at level 1. When you finish this story, you may not be totally sure what happened. It's okay, because it's going to lead you to talk a lot about the third word, and that is the word symbol. Now, whoa, whoa, whoa. Oh, I know those things in the band. You put them in your hand and you go, shh. No, no, no. That's symbol. That's a different word. This word is symbol. An event or an artifact, some object from the story that will represent something. You can probably guess from the title what that will be. A veil, let's get our vocabulary out of the way quickly. A veil is something you hang over your face. Okay? A veil is something you put over your face, so people cannot see all of your face. All right? For example, if you will back up to page 260, you'll see the word there, symbol, and then it's going to object, right? Object. It's going to be an object that will represent an idea. An idea, okay? And as we go forward now in our story, we're going to represent that. Uh-oh, look on page 272. Go ahead and look at it with me. 272. Do you see that black thing hanging over the face in the drawing on 272? That's what we mean by a veil. Okay? This is going to be a story about a minister. Wow, we're back to another preacher story. About a minister who puts a veil over his face. Why does he do that? Let's read the story now together. I'm with you on page 273. Notice the background information. We may write a few things down in our annotations for it. Set in the 1600s, a typical village of Puritan New England, the story reflects Nathaniel Hawthorne's deep awareness of the Puritan ancestry that was his. I hope you're reading with me. The Puritans lived stern lives, emphasizing hard work, religious devotion. They believed that only certain people were predestined or chosen by God to go to heaven. This belief led them to search their souls continually for signs that God had selected them. At the same time, those who behaved unusually were often thought to be controlled by evil forces. This attitude contributed to the, you're going to write this down in your notes, Salem Witchcraft Trials of 1692. You maybe heard about the Salem witch trials, where lots of people were brought forward and condemned for being witches because the devil had gotten inside of them. This is the time period that we're talking about, right? This attitude contributed to the Salem witchcraft trials of 1692, during which at least 20 accused witches were executed. In this story, Hawthorne explores how such attitudes probably led to other, more commonplace acts of cruelty. The story is set in a Puritan New England, a time of religious devotion. Okay? So here we go. Notice that we'll start on 273, and this is a fairly lengthy story. So let me exhort you, admonish you right now to make sure that you're really focusing. Don't just listen to the story, read the story along with the professional reader. All right, here we go. Hawthorne's classic, The Minister's Black Veil.
The Minister's Black Veil by Nathaniel Hawthorne. A parable. The sexton stood in the porch of Milford Meeting House, pulling busily at the bell rope. The old people of the village came stooping along the street. Children with bright faces tripped merrily beside their parents, or mimicked a graver gait in the conscious dignity of their Sunday clothes. Spruce bachelors looked sidelong at the pretty maidens and fancied that the Sabbath sunshine made them prettier than on weekdays. When the throng had mostly streamed into the porch, the sexton began to toll the bell, keeping his eye on the Reverend Mr. Hooper's door. The first glimpse of the clergyman's figure was the signal for the bell to cease its summons. "But what has good Parson Hooper got upon his face?" cried the sexton in astonishment. All within hearing immediately turned about and beheld the semblance of Mr. Hooper pacing slowly his meditative way towards the meeting house. With one accord they started, expressing more wonder than if some strange minister were coming to dust the cushions of Mr. Hooper's pulpit. "Are you sure it is our parson?" inquired Goodman Gray of the sexton. "Of a certainty it is good Mr. Hooper," replied the sexton. He was to have exchanged pulpits with Parson Shute of Westbury, but Parson Shute sent to excuse himself yesterday, being to preach a funeral sermon. The cause of so much amazement,
Top of page 274.
sufficiently slight. Mr. Hooper, a gentlemanly person of about 30, though still a bachelor, was dressed with due clerical neatness, as if a careful wife had starched his band and brushed the wiggly dust from his Sunday's garb. There was but one thing remarkable in his appearance. Swathed about his forehead and hanging down over his face, so low as to be shaken by his breath, Mr. Hooper had on a black veil. On a nearer view, it seemed to consist of 2 folds of crape, which entirely concealed his features, except the mouth and chin, but probably did not intercept his sight, further than to give a darkened aspect to all living and inanimate things. With this gloomy shade before him, good Mr. Hooper walked onward, at a slow and quiet pace, stooping somewhat, and looking on the ground, as is customary with abstracted men, yet nodding kindly to those of his parishioners who still waited on the meeting-house steps. But so wonderstruck were they that his greeting hardly met with a return. "I can't really feel as if good Mr. Hooper's face was behind that piece of crape," said the sexton. "I don't like it," muttered an old woman as she hobbled into the meeting-house. "He has changed himself into something awful, only by hiding his face." "Our parson has gone mad," cried Goodman Gray, following him across the threshold.
Now let's pause for a moment and write in our notes at level 1. This is a story about a preacher who shows up on Sunday morning ready to preach. Everything is the same about him, except now he has covered his face. This is going to be a story that analyzes how people respond to strange actions. Okay? Notice right away, people think something is wrong with him. Right? Notice, not something is right with him, something is wrong with him. Maybe it's not even him. Maybe he's gone mad, lost his mind. Let's pay attention now to the way the people respond. And are you ready for this? The minister won't say anything. Watch this.
A rumor of some unaccountable phenomenon had preceded Mr. Hooper into the meeting-house and set all the congregation astir. Few could refrain from twisting their heads towards the door. Many stood upright and turned directly about, while several little boys clambered upon the seats and came down again with a terrible racket. There was a general bustle, a rustling of the women's gowns and shuffling of the men's feet, greatly at variance with that hushed repose which should attend the entrance of the minister. But Mr. Hooper appeared not to notice the perturbation of his people. He entered with an almost noiseless step, bent his head mildly to the pews on each side, and bowed as he passed his oldest parishioner, a white-haired great-grandsire who occupied an armchair in the center of the aisle. It was strange to observe how slowly this venerable man became conscious of something singular in the appearance of his pastor. He seemed not fully to partake of the prevailing wonder till Mr. Hooper had ascended the stairs and showed himself in the pulpit, face to face with his congregation, except for the black veil. That mysterious emblem was never once withdrawn. It shook with his measured breath as he gave out the psalm. It threw its obscurity between him and the holy page as he read the scriptures, and while he prayed, the veil lay heavily on his uplifted countenance. Did he seek to hide it from the dread being whom he was addressing? Such was the effect of this simple piece of crape that more than one woman of delicate nerves was forced to leave the meeting-house. Yet perhaps the pale-faced congregation was almost as fearful a sight to the minister as his black veil to them. Mr. Hooper had the reputation of a good preacher, but not an energetic one. He strove to win his people heavenward by mild, persuasive influences, rather than to drive them thither by the thunders of the word. The sermon, which he now delivered, was marked by the same characteristics of style and manner as the general series of his pulpit oratory. But there was something, either in the sentiment of the discourse itself, or in the imagination of the auditors, which made it greatly the most powerful effort that they had ever heard from their pastor's lips. It was tinged rather more darkly than usual with the gentle gloom of Mr. Hooper's temperament. The subject had reference to secret sin, and those sad mysteries which we hide from our nearest and dearest, and would fain conceal from our own consciousness, even forgetting that the omniscient can detect them. A subtle power was breathed into his words. Each member of the congregation, the most innocent girl and the man of hardened breast, felt as if the preacher had crept upon them behind his awful veil and discovered their hoarded iniquity of deed or thought. Many spread their clasped hands on their bosoms. There was nothing terrible in what Mr. Hooper said, at least no violence, and yet, with every tremor of his melancholy voice, the hearers quaked. An unsought pathos came hand in hand with awe. So sensible were the audience of some unwanted attribute in their minister that they longed for a breath of wind to blow aside the veil, almost believing that a stranger's visage would be discovered, though the form, gesture, and voice were those of Mr. Hooper. At the close of the services, the people hurried out with indecorous confusion, eager to communicate their pent-up amazement and conscious of lighter spirits the moment they lost sight of the black veil. Some gathered in little circles, huddled closely together, with their mouths all whispering in the center. Some went homeward alone, wrapped in silent meditation. Some talked loudly and profaned the Sabbath day with ostentatious laughter. A few shook their sagacious heads, intimating that they could penetrate the mystery, while one or two affirmed that there was no mystery at all, but only that Mr. Hooper's eyes were so weakened by the midnight lamp as to require a shade. After a brief interval, forth came good Mr. Hooper also, in the rear of his flock. Turning his veiled face from one group to another, he paid due reverence to the hoary heads, saluted the middle-aged with kind dignity as their friend and spiritual guide, greeted the young with mingled authority and love, and laid his hands on the little children's heads to bless them. Such was always his custom on
Top
Sabbath
of page
day.
276.
Strange and bewildered looks repaid him for his courtesy. None, as on former occasions, aspired to the honor of walking by their pastor's side.
Fascinating. He does nothing different. Write it down, level 1. He does nothing different in his delivery of his sermon. He does nothing different in his actions after his sermon as he leaves the church house. The only difference is he has his face covered. But now, actions that once were considered to be really nice are considered to be something else. The way, level 2A, the way people make up their mind about actions as being positive or negative in their minds. So the preacher has done nothing different other than simply put something over his face. The obvious question everyone has is, why? Let's keep reading and try and maybe get a sense of why did this preacher decide to put a black veil over his face, and how long will he leave it there? Whoa, let's read.
Old Squire Saunders, doubtless by an accidental lapse of memory, neglected to invite Mr. Hooper to his table.
People aren't nice to him
The
now.
clergyman had been wont to bless the food almost every Sunday since his settlement. He returned therefore to the parsonage, and, at at the moment of closing the door, was observed to look back upon the people, all of whom had their eyes fixed upon the minister. A sad smile gleamed faintly from beneath the black veil and flickered about his mouth, glimmering as he disappeared. "How strange," said a lady, "that a simple black veil, such as any woman might wear on her bonnet, should become such a terrible thing on Mr. Hooper's face." "Something must surely be amiss with Mr. Hooper's intellects," observed her husband, the physician of the village. "But the strangest part of the affair is the effect of this vagary, even on a sober-minded man like myself. The black veil, though it covers only our pastor's face, throws its influence over his whole person and makes him ghost-like from head to foot. Do you not feel it so?" "Truly I do," replied the lady, "and I would not be alone with him for the world. I wonder he is not afraid to be alone with himself." "Men sometimes are so," said her husband. The afternoon service was attended with similar circumstances. At its conclusion, the bell tolled for the funeral of a young lady. The relatives and friends were assembled in the house, and the more distant acquaintances stood about the door, speaking of the good qualities of the deceased, when their talk was interrupted by the appearance of Mr. Hooper, still covered with his black veil.
He's still wearing it, right?
It was now an appropriate emblem. The clergyman stepped into the room where the corpse was laid and bent over the coffin to take a last farewell of his deceased parishioner. As he stooped, the veil hung straight down from his forehead, so that if her eyelids had not been closed forever, the dead maiden might have seen his face. Could Mr. Hooper be fearful of her glance, that he so